I am Abraham, and this is my story. The wind smells of dust and dung fires tonight, the same as it did the night the Lord first called me out of Haran. I am an old man now, my beard white as the wool Sarah spins by lamplight, my knees stiff from decades of walking behind flocks and tents from Ur to Canaan and back again. But there is one part of my life I return to more than any other when sleep will not come: the waiting. Not the waiting for water in the wilderness or for rain on the hills of Hebron, the waiting for a son. I remember standing outside my tent the night he first spoke the promise. The stars over Canaan are not like the stars of Ur. Here they hang low and close enough that a shepherd like me could almost believe he might reach up and close his fist around one. The Lord had brought me outside that night, and I remember the cool sand beneath my sandals, the bleating of a lamb somewhere in the dark, the smoke of the evening fire curling up past the tent poles. Look now toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to number them, he said, and then, so shall your descendants be. I believed him. I want you to understand that. I believed him, and it was counted to me as righteousness. But belief is not the same as understanding, and it is certainly not the same as ease. Belief is a seed planted in the dark, and no one tells you how long the dark will last. That was years before Sarah's womb finally opened. Years. Let me tell you what waiting does to a man's soul, because it is not gentle. I was 75 years old when I left Haran with Sarai. That was her name then, before God renamed her, and my nephew Lot, and all the souls and possessions we had gathered. I was not a young man chasing a dream. I was already old by the reckoning of most men, already established, already comfortable enough that leaving everything behind for a voice in the dark was its own kind of madness. But I went. I have always gone, even when my stomach twisted with fear on the road, even when I did not know where the road led. At first, the waiting for a son was almost bearable, because Sarai and I were still counting years the way young couples count them, with a kind of stubborn hope, joking quietly by the fire that perhaps this year, perhaps the harvest after this one. But the years did not stop. 10 years in Canaan became a bitter number between us. I remember the night Sarai came to me, her voice low so the servants would not hear, and there was a wound in it I had not heard before. "The Lord has restrained me from bearing children," she said. "Please go in to my servant Hagar. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." I confess to you now, decades later, that I should have refused. I should have waited on the Lord alone, trusted the word he had spoken to me beneath those stars, instead of trying to build the promise with my own hands, using Egyptian clay instead of divine fire. But I was tired. I was a man worn down by hope deferred, and hope deferred, Scripture would one day say, makes the heart sick. Mine was sick. So I listened to Sarai instead of listening only to God, and Ishmael was born of Hagar, and I thought, foolishly, that perhaps this was how the promise would be fulfilled. It was not. I was 99 years old, 99, when the Lord appeared to me again. 99. Say that number slowly and let it sit in your chest the way it sat in mine. My body was failing in every way a body fails a man who has lived nearly a century. My hands shook when I lifted the shepherd's staff. Sarai's body, too, had long since given up any hope of bearing life, barren in her youth, and now, in her old age, as good as dead in that regard, as Scripture would later say of us both. And yet, on that day, I fell face down in the dust before him, my forehead pressed into the hot earth, my old heart hammering against my ribs, and I heard him say words that nearly stopped my breath entirely. As for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be. I will bless her, and moreover I will give you a son by her. I laughed. God forgive me, I laughed. Not the laugh of joy, but the laugh that escapes a man when grief and disbelief collide in the same instant. I said in my heart, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? My whole body was trembling as I said it, kneeling there in the dirt, my forehead still pressed low, afraid to lift my eyes and afraid not to. And when I told Sarah what the Lord had said, I remember her face in the tent doorway, the flour still on her hands from the bread she had been kneading. She did not fall down. She laughed too, from behind the tent curtain where she thought I could not see her. A short, broken laugh that carried more sorrow in it than mirth. After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? I do not blame her. I do not blame either of us. We had waited 25 years since the promise was first spoken beneath the stars. 25 years of watching the moon fill and empty, watching Sarah grow old, watching my own strength thin like smoke. If you have ever waited on God for something your whole soul aches for, a child, a healing, a homecoming, a word of forgiveness, you know this laughter. It is not unbelief exactly. It is the sound a heart makes when it has been stretched almost past bearing. But then came the day I will never forget as long as I live, though I am old now and forget many things. It was the heat of the day, the sun standing high and merciless over the plains of Mamre, the kind of heat that makes the air itself seem to tremble above the ground. I was sitting in the door of my tent beneath the great oaks, half drowsing in that heavy noon stillness, when I lifted my eyes, and 3 men were simply there. No dust rising behind them on the road, no sound of sandals on stone. They stood before me as though the ground itself had opened and set them down. Every hair on my arms rose. My breath caught somewhere behind my ribs. I have entertained travelers my whole life. It is the law of hospitality among our people, sacred and unbroken. But something in the stillness of these 3 men, something in the way the very air seemed to hold its breath around them, told my spirit before my mind understood it. This is holy ground. I ran to them. Old as I was, I ran and bowed myself to the earth. My Lord, if I have now found favor in your sight, do not pass on by. We killed the calf, the best one, tender and choice. Sarah baked bread from the finest flour, her hands moving fast, her eyes flicking toward the tent opening again and again. I stood by the men under the oak while they ate, my heart pounding in a way I could not explain, and then one of them, and I knew this was no mere traveler, this was the Lord himself, asked, "Where is Sarah your wife?" "There, in the tent," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. And then he spoke the words I had carried like a stone in my chest for 25 years. "I will certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah your wife shall have a son." I heard the tent flap move. Sarah was listening, as wives do, from just inside the doorway, and I heard her laugh again, quieter this time, an old woman's laugh, weary and disbelieving, thinking herself unheard. "After I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also?" And then the Lord spoke words that I have repeated to myself in every dark hour since. Words I want you, whoever you are listening to this now, to carry with you long after my story ends. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Silence fell over that whole camp. Even the wind in the oak leaves seemed to still. I felt the weight of those words settle into my very bones. Not anger, not rebuke alone, but a father gently laying bare the smallness of my faith beside the vastness of his power. I was standing, I realized, in the very presence of the glory of God, disguised in the form of a traveler, and I had almost missed it. My knees went weak beneath me. Awe is not a comfortable thing. It undoes you before it rebuilds you. And the Lord kept his word, as he always does, though his timing is not our timing, and his waiting rooms are longer than we would choose. The next year, at the very time he had spoken, Sarah bore a son. I held him in my aged arms beneath the same stars I had counted decades before, and I understood then, fully, why the Lord had made us wait, so that when the child came, no one could say it was the strength of Abraham or the cunning of Sarah. It could only be said, the Lord has done this. Sarah, cradling him, laughed one more time. But oh, how different this laughter was from all the laughter before. This was laughter that broke open like dawn. God has made me laugh, she said, tears running freely down her weathered face, so that all who hear will laugh with me. We named him Isaac. He laughs, so that every time we spoke his name for the rest of our lives, we would remember, nothing is too hard for the Lord. I am old now, and I have buried Sarah, and I have watched Isaac grow into a man. But if there is one thing my long life of waiting has taught me, it is this: God is never late. He was not late when I was 75, nor when I was 99, nor even in that valley of Moriah that came later, when he asked of me the hardest thing of all. He simply is not bound by our clocks or our despair. The waiting was not wasted. It was the very ground where my faith was carved deep enough to hold the weight of his promise. If you are waiting tonight for a child, for healing, for restoration, for a word from heaven that has not yet come, do not despise the waiting. It is not empty. It is not punishment. It is the place where God is quietly proving that nothing at all is too hard for him. If you have been blessed by this story, subscribe, like, and share it with a friend.